AT&T time that we should start. All right, so we are going to tonight talk about judgmentalism. Yes, everybody's favorite topic. You can call it a variety of things. You may have heard. You may call it like Pharisaism. There's all sorts of lovely, wonderful, descriptive names for it. And we're going to talk about good judgment, bad judgment. Why bad judgment is bad, why good judgment is good, and how to avoid the bad and keep the good, because we're going to talk about some topics in the coming future where it will be very easy to fall into the bad kind of judgmentalism. And so as we talk about these different things, not only do we want to make sure that we don't fall into the trap, but this is one of the leading complaints that you will hear about religious people. Is this people in the world will say, oh, you're judging me or you're passing judgment on me. It used to be, people would say that the most quoted verse in the Bible is John 3:16. Now, I've heard people say that it's Matthew 7 and verse 1. Judge not lest ye be judged, right? To borrow from the King James. If Mr. Pickard were in here, he would say the correct version. Or he's New King James, isn't he? I think he's New King James. So let's talk about it a little bit and talk about what it means to pass judgment and just think through the process of what that means and why sometimes it's good and sometimes it's bad. So it's in the New Testament, you have a variety of words that are used. The New Testament vocabulary borrows heavily from the Old Testament, from the Greek version of the Old Testament. Greek itself had a wide variety of words used for decision making, and so just like English has lots of beautiful, rich words, vocabulary of justice and judgment, so too did the Greeks, because that sort of idea was very important to them. So they had a lot of different words for choosing and judging. We're going to focus on a couple of them, and one of the words that shows up in the New Testament text, you don't need to know the Greek words, it's just recognize that when you come across the word judge or judgment in English, it's not necessarily always the same word in the original language. So sometimes we have to do a little bit of digging to find out exactly what's being said. The first one is krisis, which just means the process of legal judgment. Like you stand before a judge, they'll hear and render a verdict, and it's that whole legal process. This word gets translated as justice, judgment, condemnation, sentenced. It shows up in a variety of ways. It has a particular emphasis in the New Testament with God on the last day. Right, this great legal judgment that happens on the last day, the day of judgment, right? It's that. That's the emphasis that we see with that word. This shows up in places like Matthew chapter 2, verse 21 through 2, Matthew chapter 10, Matthew chapter 12, and so it's all these different places where Jesus is talking about judgment and condemnation. Those are the types. This is the word that gets used. You know, on the day of judgment, Sodom will fare better than these people. On the day of judgment, Nineveh will fare better than this generation, because at the preaching of Jonah, they repented. And so there is this sort of legal sense in which the word judgment is used. Another word that shows up in the text is krino, and they're very similar, right? Krisis and krino. And this can just mean to choose something. You have a preference. There's an apple and an orange, and you prefer the orange. So in your judgment, the orange is better. So you take the orange and you eat that instead of the apple. It doesn't necessarily mean there's anything wrong with the apple. You just prefer the orange. This word can also mean to pass judgment with the hope of influencing somebody. So like if you're in a class or a room full of people like this, and we were going to pick a fruit, and everybody was going to get the same kind of fruit, and you really preferred the orange, you would do your best to try and tell people why the orange is superior to the apple. You would do your best to tell people why they shouldn't put the pineapple on the pizza, and that it could be on the side, and then if you wanted, you could put it on your own, right? That's sort of like you're trying to influence the outcome of a decision. It can be used in that way. It can also be used to talk about criticism or fault-finding or condemnation. So this word is broad. It goes all the way from just, I like oranges better than apples, to trying to influence somebody else to like oranges better than apples, all the way even to telling people that they're going to the bad place if they eat apples. So this is a really, really big word, and it's used all these ways in the New Testament text, from having an opinion to telling somebody that they're in trouble with God because they don't agree with you, and or whatever the standard is. And so that the context then of the context of the words becomes really important. And so when you're reading through, often when somebody says, the Bible says not to judge me, they're probably not going to want to sit with you and go through a 3-hour study of the context and usage of all the various Greek words in the New Testament. That's probably not what they're interested in. So you have about 30 seconds. Right? That's typically the window you've got to explain why it's okay to make good judgments and why it's wrong to make bad judgments. The same thing is true if somebody walks up to you and says, hey, I heard you're a Christian. Tell me what it means to be a Christian. You don't have 3 hours. Right? I don't know if you could really do it in 3 hours. Right? You've got about 30 seconds, and that's your window. So if you're thinking about evangelism, just from an evangelistic perspective, if somebody says, tell me what it means to be a believer, you've got 30 seconds to hook them and draw them in and make them want to know more. Same thing with this. If you're having a conversation with somebody and they say, oh, well, the Bible says you can't judge, you've got a 30-second window where you can talk about good judgment and bad judgment and all the stuff we're going to talk about tonight. Yes? Yeah, it has to be very fast, it has to be to the point, and it has to be worded in such a way that you hook their interest and make them want to talk about it a little bit more. If you can figure out how to do that in a way that works, like even just 20% of the time, please tell me what that is, because you will be a genius. It's very difficult to have that conversation about any topic when there's opposition. All right, so without going through every single use of these words as they appear in the New Testament, let's just kind of take a bird's eye view and think about some of the contexts in which judgment happens in the New Testament. Where are some places where the Bible says, don't judge, it's bad? Can you think of any off the top of your head? Matthew 7. Right, that's one. Yeah. That's the one everybody knows. Or can you think of examples in the Old or New Testament, because the vocabulary is the same, of times when somebody made a judgment and they get corrected? Yes? Yeah. They wanted to condemn this woman, and maybe or maybe not the man, who knows? He just wasn't there for whatever reason. Probably because it was a setup. Anyway, so they've got that going on, and Jesus sort of shuts down that process of condemnation. You know, if you don't have sin, now you can take the seat of judge. Who is the only person who belongs in that seat? God. Yeah. We're going to stand before the judgment seat of Christ, not the judgment seat of anybody else, because there is nobody else who is sinless, who can worthily pass judgment, who knows the hearts and thoughts and intentions of people and all the things that God does. I'm going to cheat. I'm going to tell you the example that the collective, the gaggle of cufflets came up with when we were talking through this. They thought of Samuel and David and his brothers, where Samuel comes and he thinks that the big, strong, oldest brother must be the one that God is choosing, just like perhaps he thought Saul was a good choice because he was tall and handsome, and it turns out to be the little one that God has selected. Because God doesn't make judgment. He doesn't choose the things that we choose. He doesn't make judgments the way that we make judgments. So Samuel's judgment was bad because it was based on external things. What else? Yes. Yeah. Make righteous judgment, judge rightly. That's rendered a few different ways, but that's the same. That's the heart of the idea. So Jesus is saying there is a time when it is appropriate to make a decision. There is some kind of judgment that gets made, And so you have to take that and consider the fact that it's the same person who says, judge not, or let's just modernize that some, don't judge, or you will be judged. And so it's the same person. And so there has to be some sort of context or some sort of situation in which Jesus is saying it's okay to make decisions, and another context in which Jesus is saying it's not okay to make decisions. Part of it is probably the righteous judgment, or the rightly aspect of the judgment. So if you're going to make right judgments, who would you try and line your decision up with? With whom would you align your decision-making process? Yeah, the lawgiver. Yes. And the passage in James, let's turn over there for just a minute. The passage in James is very important because we're going to get down in just a second when we start talking about some bad judgments and why they're bad. James 4 gives us some of those reasons. So he's going to say in verse 11, this is James chapter 4, starting in verse 11. I'm reading from the English Standard Version, so if yours is a little different, that might be why. Do not speak evil against one another. And evil is just bad. Don't say bad things about other people. The one who speaks against a brother or judges his brother speaks evil against the law and judges the law. If you judge the law, you're not a doer of the law, but a judge. There is only one lawgiver and judge, he who is able to save and destroy. But who are you to judge your neighbor? So what aspect does this sound like he's talking? I mean, he can't be saying, don't ever try to do the right thing. Sure. Yeah, careless, derogatory judgments, where you say just bad things about somebody. You lose your temper, you are just angry or mad, or you just don't like somebody, right? All the reasons that we say just careless things about other people. That would certainly be included in this. Have you ever changed your mind on something that is fairly significant? I have. No, that's like saying concrete. There's a church council somewhere in history about that, I'm sure. I'll give you an example of the way that I used to think about the Trinity that I didn't know, right? And this is like a really technical thing, and I'm comfortable using it as an example because it's really technical. If you ever describe God as being like water and how he can be solid like ice and he can be liquid like water, or he can be a vapor like water vapor, and you say that's what the Trinity is like. That's actually one of the oldest heresies about the Trinity. I didn't know that, and so I used that for a long time. And I would talk about how God could be all of these different things, and that's actually called modalism. And it's where there's one God and he just changes shapes. Like sometimes God looks like the Father, sometimes God looks like the Son, and sometimes God looks like the Spirit. That's probably not what you mean when you use that analogy, but that's what that analogy teaches, and the people who originally came up with the idea, that's the picture they used. You might have used a four-leaf clover before, where you have the whole four-leaf clover, and one part of the clover is the Father, a three-leaf clover, sorry. One is the Father, one is the Son, and one is the Spirit. That's partialism. You probably didn't intend to teach that when you used that analogy, but you're saying that the Father is only a part of God, just like one leaf is only a part of the clover. The Son is only a part of God. The Spirit is only... That's another very old heresy concerning the Trinity. Now, these are things that we might just sort of not even realize that we're doing, right? So we're comfortable talking about those types of things. But maybe there's bigger stuff. Like maybe you used to think it was okay to baptize babies. Maybe you were baptized as a baby. And you had to work your way through that and figure out that there's really no evidence of young people being baptized in the New Testament. It's just not there. And so you have to grapple with that. And so the reason why I've asked, have you ever changed your mind, is right now, if I took myself 23 years ago and I took myself today, I would think that the person 23 years ago was really wrong and in a really bad spot. But today I think I'm okay. So should I judge? If he was standing right here next to me, should I pass judgment on him? Or should I be patient and loving and kind and instructive and try and show a better way? Yes, be an Aquila and Priscilla. And that's a perfect example in the text of Scripture of somebody who comes and doesn't pass judgment, but sees that somebody could be helped to understand something better. And that's sort of the idea here with James, is it seems to be that condemnatory, where he says you're going to the bad place. That seems to be sort of the context, is you have to be very, very, very careful because you're going to grow. Right? If you do not ever grow in your faith, that's bad. If you believe the same thing today that you believed 10 years ago, that's bad. There should be some change. Nobody knows everything. And so we should expect to grow and change. Well, what if you, 10 years ago, you was here in the room today? How would you treat them? Would you condemn them? Or would you be gentle and patient and kind and loving with them? It's easy when you're thinking of yourself. Now some stranger you don't know who believes the exact same things that 10 years ago you believed is here in the room with you. How do you treat them? That sort of seems to be the context here. And so James is telling us that if you pass judgment on that person, we're not saying that, you can disagree. Right? We see that in John chapter 7. You're supposed to pass this righteous judgment or judge rightly, depending on your how your version words that. But you do that without condemning. So how does that happen? How do you tell somebody you think they're wrong without also saying you're going to the bad place? Yes. Yes. And when you disagree, like keeping that thought in mind, one of the most powerful things that you can do is open the Bible up to a passage and ask somebody to read it, and then just ask them, what does that mean? Yeah. Yeah. Trying to walk with them instead of trying to defeat them. That's right. Bob. Yes. That attitude that y'all are talking about is incredibly important. Have you ever read Robert Louis Stevenson? Wow, what an author. Have you ever read Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde? Yes, maybe. Excerpts? Movie? Okay, movie works. Movie works. Cliff Notes probably work. It's the end. It's the end of the book that matters. So Dr. Jekyll, Is anybody going to read it? Yeah, it's been around for a while. You've had your chance. I don't feel bad anymore. There's several movies. VeggieTales even did an episode. You've seen that one? All right, then we'll be on the same page. So Dr. Jekyll realized that inside of himself there was this evil. He could feel this evil. And that's the way that Stevenson described it. There's this evil inside of him. And he felt like the evil was holding back the good. And so he created this potion that would separate the two parts of his personality so that the good could be unshackled from the evil. Now, the downside is that the good is active during the day and the evil was active at night. And the evil part does some really awful things. And the character is surprised at how powerful the evil part of himself was. And he suddenly realized in this process that it's not that the evil was holding back the good, but the good was containing the evil. And so he stopped taking his potion that he was drinking because he realizes that the evil he was doing far outweighed the good that he was able to do. And he did some really terrible things. And so the rest of the book, after he makes that decision, is him living his life now as Dr. Jekyll and going about trying to make up for all of the bad things that he had done when he was Mr. Hyde. And Hyde, Hyde, is because that nature, that evil nature, was hidden within himself. That's why it's Mr. Hyde. Brilliant, just brilliant. So at the end of the book, he's sitting in this bench in this park, and he's contemplating all the good things that he's done, and he's looking out at the rest of humanity, and he begins to realize how superior he is to all of these other people who have just wasted their lives not doing good. And then he looks down at his hands. After having this thought, he looks down at his hands, and he's not Dr. Jekyll anymore, but he's Mr. Hyde again. Because he's realized that all along, Mr. Hyde was absolutely selfish. Everything he did was selfish. If he wanted it, he took it, and if you got in his way, he'd kill you. All of a sudden, he realized that as Dr. Jekyll, he was really just Mr. Hyde in another form. He was doing all of those good things to be selfish, to make himself feel better, to get accolades for himself, to make up for what he did, right? All of it was about himself. And so he winds up taking his life at the end of the book because he realized there's no escape from Mr. Hyde, or he believed there's no escape from Mr. Hyde. And so we have to be very careful when we pass these sorts of judgments, because that idea of doing good for the sake of comparison, or doing good for the sake of station or standing, or even making up, right? That concept is inherently selfish. And this is something that a few people have realized throughout time, but they're always borrowing God's ideas. One of my favorite philosophers, Marcus Aurelius, worded it. You may have heard the song that we sing, "Do good for the sake of goodness." Right? Where do we sing that? Oh, be good for goodness sake. Right? With Santa Claus? Right? That's like straight out of Marcus Aurelius' Meditations. Do good for the sake of goodness. That was his point. If you do good, like we often say things, why did you do this good thing? Well, it made me feel good. I mean, I'm glad. But that's a selfish motivation. You do good because it is the good thing to do. And when we think of our lives as Christians, there's never a sense in which you are trying to outweigh the bad you have done. Ever. First, you cannot. Because it's not about having more good than bad. It's about pollution. And sin pollutes things. And once something has been made unclean, it can never again enter into God's presence, no matter how much of the rest is clean. One blemish, one spot makes the lamb unworthy for an offering. So we can't do that. We see that, right? People will often talk about the Pharisees. The Pharisees are Dr. Jekyll. They really are trying to do good things. They love the law of Moses. They love it so much that they have built traditions around the law to protect it and keep it safe. Right? They don't even want to get close to possibly breaking the things that God has said through Moses. And so the motivation is really good, but some of them fell into that trap of looking out and seeing other people who aren't behaving just like them and thinking, look at how good I am compared to how bad those people are. It can, yes. It can lead us to making bad decisions, like we're going to start doing things maybe because they're showy. You can see this sometimes. No judgment, right? When people come and they'll ask for things that they can do to help in a local church. One of the stories that I heard when I was much younger was that somebody would come and they would ask the preacher for help, and he would say, well, we need the gum scraped off the bottom of the pews. And so the next week they came and they said, is there anything I can do to help? And he said, well, we need the floors in the bathrooms cleaned. And he had all these like very menial jobs. And then he came again to ask, and the question was, is there anything I can do to help in a much more public and maybe administrative capacity? And so we might find ourselves making those types of judgments. It's not even judging another person, but thinking that the best good is what gets accolades, what gets noticed. And so this idea of judging rightly is not only judging other people, but also really sitting down and saying, what truly is a good work? What really needs to be done? And what can I do to really help? There were hands. Yeah. Yes. Yes. Yeah. Yes. That very idea, like I'll be right with you, Mr. Biles. That very idea, I tell my kids, you're not a mind reader. There is no single human being who can read minds. And the only way you know what somebody think or the reason they did whatever it was is if they tell you. You can't read minds. think you're exactly right. And often we will find that if we don't take the judgmental approach, there is many times a way that you can find peace. And it's the peacemakers that Jesus said are the children of God, the sons of God. One of the examples that I like to use, I've probably used it before, long before I was ever involved, probably before I was born. The church in my hometown that I didn't even know was there until after I came back from school and was a believer and was looking for a place to go, almost split over sending money to institutions, like to orphans' homes. There were some people who felt like it was something that had to happen. There were some people who felt like it couldn't be done. And the group of men who were the shepherds there at the time sat down, and they had differing views. And they apparently, in the letter that they wrote, I didn't get to talk to any of them, but they had the letter framed there at the church building, or they did at least. In the letter that they wrote, they said, we all have opinions, but nobody has a verse that tells us what to do. And in that interest, this is how we're going to be peaceful and make our way forward. I don't remember the exact wording. They put a box out in the foyer. And if you wanted to send money to an orphan home, you put the money in the box. And then every month or week or however often, they would just take the money out of the box and they would give it to whatever group they were going to give the money to. And if you didn't want to give money, then you just didn't put money in the box. And then that way, people got to stay together, instead of taking a belligerent approach where you judge other people's motives, you judge their intentions or their hearts. And the world picks up on that. Like if we're judging in that way, people know that we're doing that. Sometimes, right, and just to be fair, there are going to be times where people get angry at you just because you don't agree with them. And you can't help that. If just even having an opinion is offensive to other people, I can't help how they react. I can only change and affect what I do. And so as we're going to move into some of the more delicate topics in the coming weeks, we have to make sure that we're approaching it with that attitude, realizing that if we ever think that we're better than people who disagree with us or who are living differently than us, we might very quickly find ourselves sitting on that park bench looking into the hands of Mr. Hyde, or standing next to the Pharisees, condemning Jesus. And the moment that I think of, that I see his disciples emulating, is Jesus on the cross. When things really come to a head, like all through his life, Jesus is arguing and he's putting forth ideas. He's trying to get people to change their mind. He's using all of the techniques, all the great teaching techniques that you could ever think of. Jesus uses them. It culminates in his crucifixion. They don't listen. They don't want to be taught. And even in that moment, when they absolutely reject everything, his reaction to them is, Father, forgive them. They don't understand what they're doing. When Stephen is being stoned, he says the same thing. And that's the attitude that the disciples carry forward. They do stand up for what's right. They're going to tell you what they believe is true. I think that's part of John chapter 7. Judge with right judgment. Judge rightly. It's okay to come to conclusions. It's okay to prefer certain things. It's not okay to be hateful or hurtful or to become judgmental or self-centered or arrogant or any of the other things that we've been talking about. And I think that's very good advice. I think it's biblical advice. It's some of the best advice that I've ever been given. Imagine that, a preacher being told, don't talk so much. But it's just great advice. Listen and don't talk so much. And I have found that the Bible studies that I go to, where I'm trying to lead somebody to Jesus, they often go much better if I let them do most of the talking. They'll tell me where they are. They will tell me what they know, what they feel, what they think. And then once I have come and stood next to them, then I can walk with them to where we both need to be. And unfortunately, I have not always been good at that. I have often taken sort of the debater standpoint, where I'm going to show you why you're wrong. Here's 3 reasons, with 7 subpoints. Yes? There was a writer who was talking about that very thing, and he said there's two types of selfish sin. There's the evil, wicked, selfish. You normally think of the people who take whatever they want. And then there's the good, selfish sin, who they find joy in checking all the boxes, so to speak, so that they can look at all the people who don't have the boxes checked and can say, look at how much better I am. Like the Pharisee and the tax collector or the publican in Jesus' parable, but how the one is lauding themselves in their prayer to God, and the other is contrite. Be merciful to me, O God, a sinner. And they ask the question, and it's a good question. Who do you think went home that day justified? And that forces you to take a step back and think, where am I in that spectrum? I often find myself, I've told my wife before, I would be a very good Pharisee. I think I would have been, I could have given Paul a run for his money. I think he had a much better memory than I do, and so maybe not. But as far as like being zealous for the traditions, that's where I would have been. I heard somebody ask the question one time, if you were at the cross, where would you have been? And they were talking about how they would have been with the disciples because they want to follow Jesus. And I'm like, I'll tell you where I would have been. Kill him. Crucify that guy. Either because they would offer me money and I'm not really paying attention to what's going on, or I would just fit right in with either the Romans, law, order, power, army, yes, fun, or the Pharisees. That's where I would have been. I don't want to be there anymore. And so when we talk about things, like we're going to talk about some hard topics, one example will be things like gender fluidity and orientation. Right? Imagine how well that conversation is going to go most of the time. Well, a lot of that is going to depend on the attitude that we take when we approach somebody. I have a cousin who is gay, and for a long time he would not talk to me at all. For a wide variety of past baggage reasons, but also because he knew how the conversation was going to go in his brain. Right? He wrote the book. Right? He played it out. He knew the things I was going to say. He knew the way I was going to treat him because he'd been treated that way before. And why would you put yourself through the pain of having to go through that experience again? And so we just didn't talk. And he was probably right. I'll be honest with you. For a while, it's probably good we didn't talk. And thinking through things like this have really helped me get to the point where now I can talk to him, and we can just talk about the weather, and we can talk about more serious things. And both of those conversations are almost always equally amicable, but it's about the attitude that we approach it with and how we speak to him. And when you look at the New Testament, who were the people that Jesus yelled at? Yes. The Pharisees. Yeah. Go ahead. Yeah. Yeah, and if you ever need reading material, like if you can't fall asleep at night, just go read through the Talmud. and all of the writings of the rabbis. You'll be out in like 3 minutes because they talk about stuff like that. How many leaves do you pluck before it becomes work? How many steps do you take before it becomes work? And they have like extensive arguments about these things that there's no grounding for any of it in Scripture. So yes, we have to be focused on the right things. And often, sometimes, we get the cart before the horse, so to speak. Especially when it comes to some of the things that we'll be talking about. My goal, like with my cousin, for example, is not to fix him. Right? That's not my goal. It's not to get him to realize the error of his ways. It's not to get any change in his behavior. That would have been my goal in the past. My goal is to take him to Jesus and to introduce him to Jesus and to show him the love and compassion and grace of Jesus and let Jesus change him and let Jesus do all of those other things that I, frankly, am just not qualified to do. And so that as we talk about many of the coming topics, that's sort of the approach that we will take. Because in just the remaining time that we have, that's really the power of Christianity. It's the power of God's grace in our lives. Power of forgiveness. Yes. Yeah, which is why, that's the exact reason why things like the young men's class that we had this past Saturday, which was phenomenal, by the way. You did a very good job. I'm looking forward, yes. Yeah, that's why we need the older men and women, or more experienced, or whatever phrase you would prefer to use. We need those individuals teaching the younger individuals, filling their minds, yes, full of Bible facts, of Scripture verses, but in addition to those things, how do you live those things out? It's relatively easy to memorize, a few Bible verses. It's very difficult to take those Bible verses and make them part of your life. And if I have been left to myself my entire life, I would not be where I am. I'm still woefully short, but I wouldn't be where I am today without the help of men and women who love me enough to say, hey, let's think through what's going on here. And so we need that. We need older men and women training and teaching the younger people how to be a believer. Thank you all very much. We're out of time, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the quarter that we have together.